My wife betrayed me and had an affair with a more powerful man right after I transferred to a new job. Here's how I uncovered the truth and took action. My treacherous wife betrayed me when I transferred to another job. I found out that she was cheating on me with a man who simply has a higher position. At the reception, a woman warmly greeted John Morgan, praising him and expressing enthusiasm about his new position at the community fund following David Mitchell's departure. John responded graciously, acknowledging the challenges that lay ahead. Richard Davis, the bank president and head of the search committee who had recommended John, beamed with pride and guided him around the room. The event was attended by local business leaders, city officials, and representatives from various charitable organizations supported by the community fund. The atmosphere was friendly, enhanced by complimentary drinks and high-quality hors d'oeuvres. Noticing a tall man conversing with the mayor, John inquired about him and the attractive woman accompanying him. Richard identified them as Reverend James O'Connor of St. Luke's Episcopal Church and Elizabeth Green, the director of the New Beginnings Women's Shelter, who also happened to be Reverend O'Connor's wife. John was surprised that a priest had a wife, but Richard explained that Elizabeth had kept her maiden name after their marriage. When John asked about the significance of meeting Reverend O'Connor, Richard described him as one of the most influential and respected figures in town, known for his integrity, and trusted for advice beyond his congregation. Intrigued, John agreed to meet them. Richard led John over to introduce him to the couple. After the introductions, Reverend James asked John if his experience at General Electric had been helpful in his new role at the community fund. John replied that while the private sector often focuses on short-term gains, its emphasis on measurable results had been invaluable in the nonprofit sector, and he considered himself results-oriented. He then turned to Elizabeth Green, complimenting her on her dynamic leadership at the shelter and suggesting she lead one of his interagency task forces. Flattered, Elizabeth accepted the offer. Later at their home, Reverend James teased Elizabeth about her blush from the compliment. Elizabeth joked that her husband could learn to give compliments more often, to which James playfully replied that, while he might not be the most charming, he was willing to learn. They ended up playfully chasing each other to the bedroom. A few months later, Reverend James met with David Mitchell for lunch to catch up. Now retired, David expressed his regret about not seeing people as often and feeling less valued. Reverend James reassured him that his old team still respected him and would seek his advice, although David suspected that the new leadership might prefer to distance itself from the past. After one of his former team members called with a question, Reverend James learned that John had reprimanded her, insisting she check with him before contacting anyone else. Reverend James thought this was unhelpful, but David dismissed it, saying the new executive had his own agenda and that consulting him might hinder the transition. Reverend James assured David that he wasn't an old relic and acknowledged his extensive knowledge about the community fund. They finished their lunch and decided to stay in touch. Reflecting on David's comments, Reverend James resolved to speak with Richard Davis to get his view on John's performance. Richard's secretary, a member of Reverend James's congregation, promptly connected him to Richard. Richard reported that John was performing exceptionally well, securing donor commitments even before the campaign started. Reverend James felt reassured, realizing his initial concerns were likely unfounded. A week later, Reverend James visited the community fund office for a meeting with an account executive. He greeted Sarah Turner, a longtime bookkeeper, with a friendly wave, despite having never been formally introduced. He then discussed an upcoming audit on homelessness with Mark Stevens, an area of special interest to him, given St. Luke's ongoing efforts to support the homeless through clothing drives and a soup kitchen. After their discussion, Mark asked Reverend James to join him for coffee in the break room, noting an unusual tone. Sensing something amiss, Reverend James agreed. Once inside, Mark poured coffee for both of them, and, after ensuring the room was clear, voiced his concerns. Mark revealed that he was considering leaving the community fund due to dissatisfaction with the new boss. According to Mark, John was a micromanager who created a tense environment, with staff constantly fearful of his reprimands. Mark described John as a petty tyrant with a short man's syndrome, and mentioned that several colleagues were also contemplating resigning. Reverend James was alarmed by this news, and Mark's comparison of John to a chihuahua only heightened his concern. As Mark glanced at his watch, he said he had to return to work, and Reverend James offered to walk with him, urging him not to make any hasty decisions. As they left the break room, Reverend James was startled to encounter John, who greeted him with an insincere cheerfulness. John abruptly invited Reverend James to his office to discuss the latest data on homelessness, dismissing any further conversation. Reluctantly, Reverend James followed John to his office, where John handed him a file and addressed him coolly, suggesting that if Reverend James had concerns, he should discuss them directly. Reverend James, feeling uncomfortable, assured John that he wasn't checking up on him, but was simply interested in how the organization was faring under the new leadership. John insisted that the organization was doing well, and advised Reverend James to come to him directly for any future information. Reverend James left the office puzzled by John's prickly demeanor. When Elizabeth arrived home, Reverend James, still unsettled by the encounter, asked her opinion on John. Elizabeth, who had worked with John's task force, described him as a breath of fresh air compared to the previous, less effective regime. Although she acknowledged that John was demanding and had stepped on some toes, she appreciated his effectiveness and decisiveness. Reverend James noted that Richard Davis praised John for his proactive approach with donors, to which Elizabeth agreed, confirming that John's methods were indeed productive. They ended the conversation with a light-hearted remark about dinner and went to prepare the meal. That night, Reverend James was haunted by the same nightmare that had troubled him for years. He and his spotter, Roberto Martinez, were on overwatch duty in Kabul. Their sniper team had become highly effective over the past 18 months, known for their exceptional teamwork. They were tasked with tracking down an enemy who had been causing significant casualties. Command decided to deploy their own team to combat this threat. James lay prone behind a rooftop chimney, his Barrett M82 hidden in the shadows, while Roberto was stationed a block away, scanning for the enemy. With their throat microphones and earbuds for communication, they were a formidable team. On the second day of their watch, James faced a difficult task. The city's irregular streets distorted sound, and they had been unable to spot the enemy amid the afternoon heat. Roberto reported seeing a young girl, no more than 10 years old, unable to move. Roberto's voice grew urgent as he described the girl's worsening condition and the lack of help from bystanders. Determined to save her, Roberto announced he was going down to assist her, despite James' pleas for him to wait for backup. As Roberto moved to help, James searched the area for any threats, only to see Roberto rushing to the girl's side. Just as Roberto scooped her up, a second shot rang out. That night, Reverend James was tormented by a recurring nightmare. He and Roberto Martinez were on overwatch duty in Kabul. James, lying behind a rooftop chimney, saw through his scope as Roberto was shot in the thigh, blood spurting from the wound. Roberto fell, trying to shield the young girl he had just rescued. Roberto's agonized voice came through the earbuds, reporting that the bullet had hit bone and that he was trapped. Despite James' determination to rescue him, Roberto warned him it was a trap designed to lure James out and kill him too. He urged James to stay put and not fall into the sniper's trap. Desperate and conflicted, James reluctantly agreed to follow Roberto's advice. Roberto, now calm despite his dire situation, asked James to pray with him. Though James was not religious, he followed Roberto's instructions to recite a prayer. As James reached the line, "Let us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil," a third shot silenced Roberto. Overwhelmed by grief and guilt, James searched the area in vain for the enemy, cursing and crying as a fourth shot claimed the girl's life. Awakened by the nightmare, James sat up in bed, drenched in sweat and pale. Each repetition of the dream left him questioning his actions and feeling a deep sense of failure. He quietly left the room to sit in the living room until his trembling subsided, trying to find solace before returning to sleep. When Elizabeth woke up, she found the bed empty and discovered James sleeping on the couch. Though his nightmares were common, she hated that he was still tormented by his war experiences. She gently covered him with a blanket and prepared for her day, selecting a silk suit from the closet. Elizabeth chose an outfit she had altered from a designer label she'd found at a thrift store. With a full day ahead at a community fund task force meeting, she wanted to appear both professional and smart. Before leaving, she left James a note about her schedule and the possibility of running late. The task force meeting was held at a high-end hotel, a venue John Morgan preferred for its neutrality and quality service. Elizabeth, initially skeptical of the extravagance, appreciated the professional setting and the effective way John managed the meeting. She admired his skill in steering the discussion and organizing tasks efficiently. As the meeting concluded, John thanked each participant in the lobby. When he reached Elizabeth, he asked her to stay behind. He handed her a key to a breakout room and directed her to wait there while he finished with the others. Surprised, Elizabeth headed to room 514, where she found a table with papers and a laptop. She chose to wait on the love seat, her curiosity piqued by the unexpected request and John's strong presence. After what felt like an eternity, Elizabeth heard the door unlock and saw John enter. He nodded at her and, without a word, removed his suit jacket and loosened his tie before sitting on the edge of the bed. Elizabeth began to sit on the love seat, but John instructed her to remain standing. Surprised, she complied. He then remarked on her impressive presence, noting that she had been the most intelligent and natural leader in the group. As she blushed at the praise, John told her to hold her response. He walked around her, inspecting her as he spoke. Returning to his seat, he commented on her leadership skills and how her staff likely depended heavily on her for decisions, even minor ones. Elizabeth thought about how true that was, realizing how much she was leaned on. John then revealed that he understood the burden of such responsibility and acknowledged her hidden desire for someone else to take over, to make decisions for her. His insight shocked her, as he had tapped into her unspoken wish to be relieved of constant responsibility and to follow someone else's lead for a change. As Elizabeth listened to John, she felt entranced by his words, which tapped into desires she had long repressed. Her need to submit grew stronger, overwhelming her reservations. John then directed her to remove her jacket, blouse, and skirt, which she did under his stern gaze. Standing in only her underwear and pantyhose, she felt a mix of humiliation and arousal. John's harsh treatment intensified her feelings as he tore her pantyhose. He then began to engage with her aggressively, with no tenderness or affection. The experience was raw and dominating, heightening her arousal despite the pain. John's actions escalated as he spanked her, touched her, causing both pain and unexpected pleasure. Afterward, he briefly rested on her before dressing and leaving Elizabeth exhausted and immobilized. When John returned, he was impeccably dressed and showed no sign of what had transpired. He informed her that the room was paid for and left with his laptop and papers, closing the door behind him. Elizabeth slowly got up and went to the bathroom. The woman in the mirror was unrecognizable. Her makeup was smudged, her hair disheveled, and her panties were visible through her torn pantyhose. As she tried to fix her appearance, she couldn't stop questioning herself about what had just happened. When she managed to restore some semblance of normalcy, she gathered her things and checked the hallway. Seeing it was clear, she quickly left and took the elevator, where a maid gave her a peculiar look. Elizabeth wondered if she had overheard anything. Driving home, Elizabeth was lost in a daze, tormented by images of the hotel encounter. She felt deep guilt and self-loathing, particularly over her infidelity with John Morgan and the realization of how much she had enjoyed it. As she arrived home, the thought of facing James filled her with dread. She felt certain he would know what she had done. Panicking, she wiped her tears away before entering the house. Finding James had prepared dinner, she was overwhelmed and decided to lie about her health, claiming she was feeling unwell and needed to skip dinner to rest. James was worried about Elizabeth, but she reassured him and insisted he enjoy his dinner. Once he returned to the table, she retreated to the bedroom undressed and got into bed. When James checked on her later, she feigned sleep, though guilt kept her awake for hours. The next morning, James decided to let her rest, thinking it would be beneficial if she stayed home. He was surprised when Elizabeth called before noon, saying she felt better and was going to work. James was pleased by her dedication. 2 days later, while James was working on his sermon, Mrs. Wilson informed him that John Morgan was there to see him. James welcomed John, who revealed he wasn't there for community fund matters, but for a personal issue. John inquired about the Episcopal Church's stance on confession, catching James off guard. James explained that while the includes general confession in its services, private confession is rare and lacks the formal confessional structure found in Roman Catholicism. John asked if confessions were strictly confidential. James confirmed that the seal of confession meant that priests must keep confessions completely confidential, even after the confessor's death. James studied John carefully, suspecting that he was there to make a confession. John confirmed his intent and asked about the process, noting the absence of a confession box at St. Luke's. James explained that he preferred to keep confessions informal and private, typically holding them in his office to avoid disturbances. John expressed his desire to confess adultery, revealing that he had engaged with a married woman. When James asked if he wished to name her, John declined, indicating that James knew her. Although saddened by the involvement of someone he knew, James focused on John's apparent lack of remorse, which irritated him. John's casual attitude toward his actions prompted James to question his penitence. James advised John to spend time reflecting on the gravity of his actions and their consequences. Rather than performing traditional prayers, he suggested reading the General Confession of Sin from the Book of Common Prayer and revisiting the 10 Commandments, particularly the 7th. John took the book from James, expressed relief, and left. James, returning to his desk, was puzzled by John's visit. He had never seen John at St. Luke's or any other church, and the request for confession was unexpected. James was concerned about the implications of John's adultery, particularly its potential impact on his professional and personal circles, including the community fund. He regretted that people often acted on impulse rather than reason. Meanwhile, Elizabeth struggled with persistent distractions at work, disturbed sleep, and troubling dreams. She felt a growing distance from James, which alarmed her, given his supportive nature. James, reflecting on John's casual attitude toward his confession, questioned the sincerity of his penitence. Frustrated and burdened by his role, James wished he could discuss his concerns with someone, but knew he had to keep them confidential. After a long day, Elizabeth nervously called John Morgan. When he answered, his smooth voice made her uneasy. Despite her fear, she asked to see him again, emphasizing her need. His laugh made her shudder. On weekends, James was always busy with last-minute preparations for Sunday services. So when Elizabeth said she needed to work on Saturday afternoon, he was relieved, as it meant he wouldn't have to attend to her. When Elizabeth returned home that evening, James was alarmed by her appearance. She looked exhausted and was visibly in pain. She brushed off his concerns, attributing it to an early period, and went to bed early without eating. James decided to insist on a doctor's visit. On Sunday, Elizabeth skipped church, worsening James's worry. After services, he hurried home with her favorite fast food, relieved to find her feeling better. She attributed her discomfort to a short-term virus and dismissed the idea of seeing a doctor. James was reassured enough about Elizabeth's condition to attend the vestry meeting that evening, though he remained deeply worried as he drove to the church. He recalled meeting Elizabeth during a difficult time in his life. After his military service and struggling with nightmares, he met her at Student Health, where she had offered comfort and support. Their connection had grown, leading to their marriage in the Divinity School chapel, and she had been his steadfast support ever since. On Monday, as James was finishing up at his desk, Mrs. Wilson informed him that John Morgan had returned. Though preoccupied with Elizabeth, James asked her to bring John in. When John arrived, he confessed to committing adultery with the same woman again, showing no real remorse. James was disappointed and questioned John's sincerity, emphasizing the need for genuine contrition and consideration for the woman and her family. John brushed off James's concerns, claiming that discussing his actions had made him feel better. James, troubled by John's visit, paced his office in frustration. He wondered if John was mocking the church, testing him, or genuinely conflicted. Regardless, James felt he should focus on helping his congregation rather than dealing with John's games. He was particularly concerned about the impact on the community fund and debated whether to alert someone on the board about John without breaching confidentiality. Meanwhile, Elizabeth struggled with guilt over her infidelity, her attraction to John, and the ecstasy she experienced with him, creating a powerful internal conflict. Despite hating herself for cheating on James, she was torn by her desire for John. Desperate to resist, She was still stunned when John called, giving her a curt command to meet him at the Royal Palms Hotel that weekend. When James got home that evening, Elizabeth sensed he was preoccupied, but he brushed off her concerns, attributing it to a minor issue with a parishioner. She chose not to press further, and instead mentioned plans to visit her sister for the weekend. James agreed, asking her to give Meghan his best. Later, James struggled to sleep, worrying about his encounter with John Morgan. He resolved to visit the community fund the next morning to investigate further, which helped him finally relax. Elizabeth also had trouble sleeping, fixated on John and her compulsion to submit to him. She tried to rationalize her behavior as just a fling and convinced herself it was a temporary indulgence. Yet she felt guilty and hypocritical, aware of the excuses she often heard at the women's shelter. She also blamed the pressure of James' role and his overly considerate nature for her dissatisfaction, though she knew these traits were part of why she married him. What hurt Elizabeth the most was knowing how much James needed her. When she first met him, he was a veteran struggling with his past. Her most vivid memory was the night he broke down, recounting his best friend's death. Though shocked by his past, she was moved by his decision to attend divinity school and admired his resilience. Over time, she helped him rise from his struggles to become a respected community figure, though she knew he remained fragile. Her identity felt like a betrayal, risking not only her vows, but James' well-being. The next morning, Elizabeth's pillowcase was damp from her tears. At St. Luke's, Rev. James scheduled a meeting with Mark Stevens at the community fund, hoping to understand John Morgan's odd behavior. On his way, he encountered John, who asked him to visit his office after the meeting. Rev. James reluctantly agreed to visit John after his meeting with Mark Stevens, though he preferred not to be seen by John. After a brief discussion about homelessness, he went to John's office. Inside, John sat behind a high desk, looking smug. Without wasting time, John confessed that he planned to commit adultery that weekend and wanted to confess in advance to avoid trouble later. Rev. James, infuriated by the mockery of the sacrament, told John he would pray for him, but could no longer serve as his confessor. He left troubled and frustrated, wondering if John might be mentally ill. On Saturday morning, Elizabeth seemed eager for her weekend getaway. James took a break from his routine to see her off and noticed she was preoccupied, which he chalked up to her excitement about seeing her sister. He told her to drive carefully and said he'd miss her, but she was too hurried to fully engage. As she drove away, he called out, "I love you," but she didn't hear. Back inside, James felt uneasy, and a troubling thought crossed his mind. John had mentioned taking his lover to the beach. He tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but the idea gnawed at him, affecting his concentration on his Sunday sermon. He considered calling Elizabeth, but was unsure how to ask without causing suspicion or conflict. Instead, he thought of calling Meghan, Elizabeth's sister, to confirm Elizabeth's visit. However, he worried that asking Meghan might reveal his doubts or make Meghan seem complicit if she was covering for Elizabeth. In a panic, he finally decided to call Meghan using a pretext, hoping to ease his anxiety. Meghan answered the phone, relieved to hear from James, but her tone shifted when she realized he wasn't calling about Elizabeth's well-being. James reassured her that Elizabeth was fine and asked Meghan to visit, as they hadn't seen her in a while. Meghan mentioned she was leaving for Boston in an hour and wouldn't return for a week, but hoped to visit next month. When she asked to speak with Elizabeth, James froze, realizing Elizabeth had lied about visiting her sister. The revelation struck James with the same anguish he felt during the war. He was overwhelmed by the betrayal and grief, realizing that Elizabeth's strength and love, which had been his anchor, were now gone. His initial pain quickly turned to anger, especially towards John Morgan, whom he now believed had been using Elizabeth to humiliate him. James's initial shock turned to intense suspicion about how John had entangled Elizabeth. He wondered if John had seduced, drugged, or blackmailed her, or if Elizabeth had initiated the affair herself. The thought made him violently ill. After vomiting, James's thoughts cleared. He realized that Elizabeth had betrayed him repeatedly, based on John's confessions and her recent suspicious behavior. John's motives went beyond mere lust. He seemed to be waging a personal war against James. John's confessions had put James in a tough spot. Although James suspected Elizabeth's infidelity, he was hesitant to reveal John's admissions, fearing he would break his vow of confidentiality. He grappled with whether John's lack of genuine remorse justified breaking his oath, questioning if he had the right to determine the validity of the confession. Unable to resolve his dilemma, James decided to investigate on his own. With his limited budget, he searched online for beach resort hotels and, based on room rates, called the most expensive one. The Royal Palms confirmed that Mr. and Mrs. John Morgan were checked in, but James chose not to speak to them, realizing it was too late. Feeling defeated, James slumped in his chair and realized he had neglected to ask God for help. He prayed for guidance, but found his faith empty and his prayers meaningless. Feeling abandoned, he despaired, questioning his worth as a priest and feeling he had lost everything: his wife, marriage, and faith. In his sorrow, James recalled his time after Roberto's death. He had withdrawn and obsessively studied the sniper's tactics that ended Roberto's life. In the afternoon, James prepared for his ambush by bringing his M40 Magnum, a decoy stuffed with newspapers, and a spare uniform and helmet. He set up the decoy to draw the sniper out from the minaret's gallery and took his own position nearby. As the call to prayer played, James saw the barrel of the Magnum through his scope. He adjusted his aim and fired, causing an explosion of bricks. He continued until he emptied 3 clips, ensuring the threat was neutralized. Although command was unhappy with his actions, James was honorably discharged due to PTSD and awarded the Expert Rifleman Medal. Re-energized by the memory, James retrieved his Barrett from storage, cleaned it, and placed it back in the bedroom. Despite feeling he wasn't a good husband or priest, he was confident in handling his enemies. On Sunday, parishioners at St. Luke's noticed a marked shift in Rev. James's demeanor. His usually positive expression was replaced with a stern, foreboding look. During the general confession, he emphasized the solemnity of the words, "We have done those things which we ought not to have done, and we have left undone those things which we ought to have done, and there is no health in us." For his sermon, he focused on the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot's wife being turned into a pillar of salt, surprising many with the dark tone. After the service, while congregants typically engaged with Rev. James, most hurriedly left that day. Richard Davis approached the priest, concerned. He asked if everything was okay, noting James's uncharacteristic demeanor and the absence of his wife, Elizabeth. Rev. James assured him that Elizabeth was visiting her sister for the weekend and would return the next day. Richard offered his support, though he remained visibly concerned. After changing out of his robes, Rev. James was about to head home when he answered a call at the reception desk. Sarah Turner from the Community Fund was on the line, requesting a meeting that afternoon. Although he was reluctant to see anyone, James agreed to meet her at 3 p.m. He could sense from her voice that she was upset and felt a duty to assist her, despite not knowing her well. Rev. James met Sarah outside the church and escorted her to his office. Once seated, he asked how he could help. Sarah, on the verge of tears, expressed concern about troubling developments at the Community Fund and handed him a stack of papers for review, mentioning she couldn't reach David Mitchell, who was on vacation. Later, after visiting elderly parishioners at a retirement home, James returned to his office to examine the documents. A text from Elizabeth read, "Having a great time with Megan. Staying over until Monday morning. See you then. Love you." Distraught, he fought the urge to smash his phone, left his office, and walked through the quiet streets near the Community Fund, taking notes before heading home. On Monday morning, Elizabeth was running late from her beach trip, having slept poorly and feeling sore. She hoped the discomfort would keep her alert during the drive. When Elizabeth arrived at the hotel on Saturday, John instructed her to check in as Mrs. Morgan. The clerk handed her a key to the penthouse suite, and Elizabeth noted John's taste for luxury with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Upon entering the suite, John immediately ordered her to undress. Elizabeth saw a suitcase filled with bondage gear and felt a mix of fear and thrill. The night was a blur of intense and degrading activities, with John's stamina likely aided by stimulants. At one point, a loud knock interrupted them. John answered the door, and boxers to find hotel management checking on Mrs. Morgan. Elizabeth, humiliated, had to present herself in a towel. She walked back to the bedroom, exposing her reddened rear to the manager, who left with a reminder to keep noise levels down. Later, John ordered room service, and Elizabeth had to hurriedly cover herself with sheets as the bellboy delivered their food. The same scene played out when the food was cleared away. After dinner, while watching a bondage film, John, inspired by the movie, used a ball gag on Elizabeth to avoid further interruptions. Despite her screams, the management didn't return. When Elizabeth woke on Sunday, she panicked at the thought of being late for church, but then remembered where she was and felt guilty. She tried to brush it aside as John announced they would spend the afternoon at the beach. He handed her a tiny white swimsuit with all modesty inserts removed. It clung to her body and would become transparent when wet. At the beach, Elizabeth felt a mix of embarrassment as she drew stares from men and disapproving looks from women. John enjoyed the attention, making her walk ahead to maximize the. After returning to the suite, John took her to a fancy dinner where Elizabeth began to look forward to their return. However, once back in their room, John swiftly removed her dress, placed a ball into her mouth, and bound her to the bed face down. He then covered her with a sleep mask, leaving her helpless. After an intense session of arousal, Elizabeth was startled by a knock on the door. Although she couldn't see or hear well due to the sleep mask, she felt the bonds on her ankles loosen, leaving her restrained by her wrists. She then sensed a larger presence behind her, with large hands gripping her hips. When he finally collapsed on top of her, she passed out from the overwhelming sensations. Upon waking, she found herself on her side, with her wrists freed. She felt the heavy stranger reposition her to straddle him. As she reached down, she was astonished by the size of his organ, which was so large her hands couldn't fully encircle it. As John and the big man began to move together, the initial awkwardness gave way to a powerful rhythm. Elizabeth felt overwhelmed, screaming in pleasure until all three collapsed in exhaustion. When she woke up, sunlight filled the room, and the big man was gone. John, freshly showered and dressed, told her flatly, "Next time, there will be 5 men." Elizabeth shuddered at the thought. After John left, Elizabeth quickly packed her things, ran a comb through her hair, and headed for the lobby. John had already settled the bill, so she just had to deal with the desk clerk's lingering stare, which she realized was due to her not wearing any underwear. Panicked, she drove to a Walmart and rushed to the women's wear section to buy a white bra and a 3-pack of panties. In the parking lot, she awkwardly changed into them while sitting in her car, drawing curious glances from a teenage boy nearby. As she drove, a wave of guilt washed over her. The past weekend felt like a bizarre dream. Had she really betrayed her husband with such debauchery? Tears welled up as she thought about James and the shame he would feel if he knew. She vowed to be a better wife and never see John again, but the memory of John's promises made her shiver. Conflicted, she questioned why she desired such behavior despite loving her husband. She blamed John for tempting her, but deep down, she knew she was also at fault. She hadn't been forced. She had chosen to stay and partake in what he offered. As Elizabeth drove through the outskirts of the city, she pushed her turbulent thoughts aside, focusing on the urgent tasks awaiting her at the office. Arriving at the women's shelter, she was quickly overwhelmed by paperwork and phone calls, losing track of time. During a brief lunch break at her desk, she realized she hadn't called James. She dialed the church office and reached Mrs. Wilson, who informed her that James was at a meeting and might stay overnight at the hospital for a visitation. There was no other message. Elizabeth felt frustrated and uneasy about the delay in reconnecting with James. The thought of him possibly avoiding her or being upset gnawed at her, though she dismissed the idea of him knowing about her weekend as too awful to consider. Returning home late, she found the parish house dark and James' car missing. With relief, she unpacked her suitcase, ran a load of laundry, and took a long shower to wash away the lingering discomfort from the hotel. While changing, she noticed a long black bag in the corner of the bedroom, realizing it contained James' old Magnum, which had been stored in the attic. She recoiled. The sight of it brought back troubling memories of James' dark days after returning from the Middle East, and made her feel uneasy. Nervously, Elizabeth tried calling James' cell phone, but only reached his voicemail, remembering he turned his phone off at the hospital. She felt uneasy and couldn't sleep despite her exhaustion. The next morning, Father James found a note from Mrs. Wilson about Elizabeth's call and set it aside, deciding to address it later. Sarah Turner then arrived with additional papers, which made him uneasy. He quickly called Richard Davis to arrange a meeting and left his office with a grim expression. John Morgan, annoyed by a summons from Richard Davis, complained about the inconvenience as he drove to the bank. Spotting Father James leaving the bank, he sneered, recalling their recent encounter. At the bank, Richard informed John that the trustees had unanimously decided to remove him as executive director of the community fund, effective immediately. Ignoring John's handshake, Richard was calm and composed, but his eyes were hard. John was outraged, confronting Richard and demanding to know what was going on. Richard calmly presented a set of expense reports detailing numerous unauthorized personal purchases, inappropriate expenditures, and overspending beyond the community fund's limits. John hastily reviewed the papers, tearing them apart and dismissing the issue as trivial. He argued that his increased donations and higher revenues for the fund more than justified any overspending, and claimed he was worth more than his salary. Richard, filled with anger and contempt, explained that John had no right to decide what was acceptable with donor money. The funds were intended for charitable use, not for John's personal indulgences. Richard also noted that John's attempt to reimburse a personal trip as a business expense was deceitful, as the hotel confirmed there was no conference. John argued that the high-pressure nature of his job entitled him to some relaxation at the fund's expense, likening it to investing. He also threatened legal action, stating that his contract would protect him from termination and that his attorney would sue for damages and restraining orders. Richard acknowledged that while John could pursue legal action, the community fund would ultimately prevail and pursue both civil and criminal charges. He offered a deal. If John admitted to misusing funds and agreed to restitution, he could resign quietly, avoiding charges. Richard presented John with a legal document, advising him to sign it as the best deal he could get. John, fuming, tucked the document into his coat pocket and said he would show it to his attorney, dismissing it with contempt. Richard, puzzled, noted that there seemed to be more to John's anger and speculated that it might involve Father James. John erupted with excitement, accusing James of breaking his priestly vows by revealing a confession. He claimed that James had betrayed him and that he intended to expose the priest and ruin his reputation. Richard, confused, asked for clarification. John revealed that he had confessed an affair to James but hadn't named the other person. He insisted that James had broken his vow of secrecy once he realized the affair was with his own wife. Richard, in disbelief, defended Elizabeth, asserting she would never cheat on James. John taunted Richard with explicit details about the affair, shocking him. Richard, now alarmed, urgently advised John to sign the document and leave town immediately, warning him that James's military background made him dangerous. John dismissed Richard's warnings about Father James's strength and dedication, insisting he was not afraid of either the priest or the board of trustees. He stormed out of Richard's office, slamming the door behind him.